Good afternoon, everyone. We will start in a minute, just so we gather more people. Now that we have the recording in progress, I would like to officially start our Nexus Forum talks on sovereignty and open source working group public webinar. So welcome, good afternoon, everyone, to the next edition. My name is Daniel Pavlica, and I'm thrilled to moderate today's webinar. This one is focused on sovereignty and open source, which is a key pillar of the European Cloud Edge IoT continuum. So today we are joined by two distinguished speakers and co-leaders of the Nexus Forum working group on sovereignty and open source. Alberto Marti from OpenNebula Systems and Sachiko Muto from RISE Research Institutes of Sweden. But before we go there, I would like to briefly go through what we will be talking today. So next slide, please. We will be covering the project overview, then we will have the main session with our co-leaders, and then where we encourage you the most is to write down the questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and also to raise your voices if you have any questions. So next slide, please. Briefly, to mention the Nexus Forum project aims to boost the consolidation of the European computing continuum and to provide a forward-looking and bold vision in new areas and directions. Next slide, please. We are doing so by having set some key objectives. One is to deliver a strategic outlook on the cognitive computing continuum, future, to produce annual research and innovation roadmaps and policy recommendations, as well as to nurture the European computing constituency and to engage research and industry ecosystems. To facilitate that, we have established 10 thematic working groups. Next slide, please. And sovereignty and open source is one of them. So we also have working groups that are aligned with the European Alliance for Industrial Data Edge and Cloud and IPSI work streams. Next slide, please. So Alberto and Sachiko, would you have willingness to introduce yourself a bit more? So Sachiko, would you like to start?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Sachiko Muto. As Daniel said, I'm a senior researcher at RISE, which stands for Research Institutes of Sweden. I'm also the chair of an organization called Open Forum Europe and have sort of been active in the intersection of open source and public policy since 2007. And so have a lot of things to say, and I know Alberto as well. It's always great to talk to Alberto. I think we have, just the right amount of overlap in terms of our opinions, and a healthy amount of disagreement, which I think always makes it a pleasure for me to talk about all things open and digital sovereignty with Alberto. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Thank you very much, Sachiko. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I can listen to me fine. Yeah, I'm basically here to listen to what Sachiko has to say, actually. So, no. So for me, it's always a pleasure too. In my case, I come from industry as VP of open source innovation at OpenNebula Systems, dealing with different internal and external projects when it comes to developing the OpenNebula itself as a platform, as a cloud computing platform, but also engaging with consortiums and other initiatives when it comes to joint development of technologies or integration of different open source technologies, especially European ones. And then since March 2024, I'm also the chair of the industry facilitation group of the IPSI cloud. So the important, let me see if I get it right, important project of common European interest on next generation cloud infrastructure and services. We make it so complex on purpose, which is, as you know, the mechanism that's mobilizing around 3 billion euros in in cloud and its technologies, in the development of European cloud and its technologies, most of them open source.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and also Sachiko. So both of you bring practical implementation and also policy insight, which makes you ideal voices to guide today's dialogue. So I would like to move us straight away to the questions and to the first question. And let's start with the foundation. So the first question is, how does open source contribute to Europe's digital sovereignty? So we hear the term quite often, but let's clarify why openness matters and how it can become a strategic asset in strengthening European autonomy. Alberto, would you like to start?
Okay, I'm going to be a bit provocative. I'm going to say it doesn't contribute to this to Europe's digital sovereignty in itself. And I think it will really contribute to Europe's digital sovereignty. And until you meet my cat, that's no, sorry. Until we identify and really define a concept that's missing in all these discussions, which is the concept of European open source. So I think to move forward and to really bridge this gap between open source and digital sovereignty, we need to define what it means for us, for Europe, the concept of European open source. Because otherwise we are stuck in endless discussions and sometimes very theoretical approaches to how open source helps innovation, how it fosters collaboration, how it brings sovereignty, blah, blah, blah. But we cannot really mobilize all the resources and bring people together with a clear geo-strategic vision. But happy to hear what Sachiko has to say. Like if my cat away from the camera because she loves the camera.
I have a Spanish water dog waiting outside my door. I could unleash as well, but I'll hold that for when I card for when I really need it. So I'm happy to talk about this, and I think that actually I agree with you, Alberto. It doesn't in and of itself, open source doesn't in and of itself sort of deliver digital sovereignty. I think that there's a huge potential, I think, for open source to strengthen Europe's digital sovereignty. And I mentioned that I've been in this field for many years, and to some extent, when I started back in 2007, I talked about we talked a lot about economic freedom. So for Europe's public sector, we were arguing against sort of lock-in to specific companies and their technologies. And I think the way that open source can deliver this kind of user autonomy, that's the same we're talking about now. It's just that it has taken on a whole new sort of geopolitical importance as well. So it has also moved up the political agenda. And if I can say what I'm hoping that open source is going to do, is that it sort of, I think, beautifully allows for a sort of third way. When you hear sovereignty, there is this notion that this could lead to isolationism. I wouldn't say exactly autarky, but some sort of isolationism away from global technology. And in my mind, open source, if we understand what it is and how we can leverage it, would allow Europe to continue to collaborate internationally, continue to benefit from and also contribute to the development of global technology, at the same time retaining a sense of control over its digital assets, and also, in a worst case scenario, sort of be able to continue to manage its technology for the good of Europe. But this is what my hope, and I've just returned from actually the UN Open Source Week, which was held last week in New York, and it's interesting because a lot of governments are looking at open source to strengthen their digital sovereignty. So there isn't this sort of zero-sum game. It's not that Europe should have digital sovereignty from somebody, from a specific other. You know, it's about the fact that all governments, you know, can potentially engage in open source and benefit from technology at the same time retaining some sense of ownership and control. So that's my hope. We're not there yet. A lot of things need to happen, and I think you'll hear me talk more about, you know, the need to identify what key strategic technologies we depend on and what capabilities we need in order to actually have this sense of autonomy. So.
Thank you both also for underlying that open source is not just a licensing model, but also quite a political and economic lever as well. Now on the next question, I would like us to examine what's actually at stake. So where do current dependencies create vulnerabilities and how should we respond? So the question that I'm posing to you is, what are the risks and dependencies Europe faces in critical infrastructure? Sachiko, would you like to be the first one for this?
It's a very broad question again, and of course, I think that when it comes to specific technologies and specific risks, I mean, I'm hoping that there are some people in the audience also that will be happy to engage with us on that, because that's a significant mapping exercise that I think is happening not just in Nexus Forum, but also in other projects and initiatives. Maybe Alberto, also you want to talk about what's happening in some of the other initiatives like the Alliance, etc. But understanding this is really important, the mapping of what those risks and dependencies are. And I think, of course, the European Commission is doing that in other areas too, when it comes to hardware, you know, specific actions targeted, like sort of, you know, targeting chips, etc., and the whole supply chain. I think what I've been focusing mostly on is also like seeing this kind of software as part of that, you know, critical infrastructure. And a risk and dependency, you can talk about, you know, sort of, are we, do we have a dependency on a specific proprietary technology? That's one sort of risk and dependency, in the sense that that also means that if somebody turns that off, or somebody doesn't renew the license, that is a kind of risk. Then, of course, there are the sort of the risks and dependencies that we have that also pertains to open source, for example, and to all software, where there are sort of vulnerabilities in the software, and sort of how we solve what I see as a sort of shared responsibility for addressing those specific sort of security concerns. But I guess the question is about sort of, are we dependent on specific proprietary or foreign technologies? Do we know what they are? And you know, how do we address that at the European level? I guess that's the main thing. And I don't think that anybody knows exactly all of this. I think there are several mapping activities happening. And when we were, as part of Nexus Forum, we participated also in a workshop that was organized in Japan. And it was interesting to see how Japan is also looking at mapping sort of their strengths and weaknesses and relative dependencies for the whole computing continuum. And I think in this context, it's also interesting for us to see, you know, do European mapping and see how that also relates to the mapping that's, for example, done in Japan or Korea. We have, as Nexus Forum, partners in those countries, and to see if, you know, collectively with some of those countries, we can also address those things.
Thank you, Sachiko. Alberto, your opinion on this?
I think I think the problem is specifically with open source is that it kind of hides some of the risk or dependencies. I think that I mean you assume when you use open source. I think on the one hand, I think looking at how we manage or kind of the software we use for critical infrastructures in Europe and companies, but also public administrations, I think on the one hand, big tech has been very, very successful over the last 15 years or so to colonize the open source world. And I still, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when IBM was making jokes about Linux and memes and this kind of stuff. So this ridicule approach, and now obviously it's very different. So I think they've been very, very, very skillful in getting to control some of the main tools and communities behind open source. And at the same time, big tech has also been very very, very successful in also removing or neutralizing the perception that there is a risk, and you build dependencies with them when you use some open source technology. So the fact that you use some open source technologies for running your critical infrastructure, that doesn't mean you're not assuming dependencies, sometimes very big dependencies with the same very big corporations open source was fighting at the very beginning. So I think from the European perspective, some of the things that we have to fight, and that's a problem of perception, that for many people it's very difficult to assume that over the years we have developed very deep dependencies with the same companies some open source technologies were born to fight against. So that's a problem, but it's more kind of a cultural thing than a technological debate. Well, we could talk, I mean, we could say the same about kind of the internal resistance in some organizations to change from one technology to another, or to kind of liberate themselves from some of these kind of toxic relationship, kind of the Stockholm syndrome that some people seem to suffer with big tech, also their tech providers or the tech vendors. But then we get into the psychology of collective, but also individuals in the IT world.
Thank you both. I would also like us to look at solutions, and that is the next question, mostly related to what mechanisms could help public and also private actors adopt and grow sovereign digital infrastructure. So the question is, how can the EU better support and scale sovereign open source projects? Sachiko, would you like to start with this one?
Sure. And maybe I'll use that time also to come back to something that Alberto was saying in answer to the previous question. I think it relates also, but just again on this sort of, I agree completely that just open source, saying we have an open source first, or preferred open source, procurement policy, whatever. This in and of itself does not lead to digital sovereignty. And in fact, I have, as part of my research work, also interviewed public sector officials who are locked into, local companies as well, because, they have asked for, software to develop with an open source license, but, the capability, the knowledge of that technology sits in only one company. So of course you can be locked into sort of a local supplier in this way. And so of course this is so it just shows the mechanism of lock-in. And of course when that happens to a big proprietary technology, that's the worst case scenario, but it can also happen in open source. You can still be locked in because you're lacking the capability of actually sort of taking over ownership of that technology, to maintain that technology, or there's a lack of competition. There's a lack of competition between companies. So, you have that if an open source technology is dominated by a single vendor, for example, like that. And that, again, it can be at the large scale with a big hyperscaler company, or it can be locally produced software that is, done by an SME. So, again, I'm returning to this notion of understanding how what are the technologies that we are depending on, and do we have the skills and to shoulder responsibility, or at least to kind of have an active engagement with those technologies. Technologies are moving fast too. There needs to be, we have to have the people involved in developing that technology and playing sort of it's open source means that we're open to doing this, but if we're not doing that, then it has little value. And so I think that is my message always to policymakers, that we should encourage the development of open source skills. We should also encourage European companies to recognize the strategic importance of open source, and not just all companies are using open source, but oftentimes it's just, as a sort of easy way to access free code, but it's not used as a way to leverage or to try to steer technology in a specific direction, etc. So I think that, again, identifying our strategic dependencies and, developing the skills, but also, again, I think that at the highest political level, we have the possibility to tell also European companies that they should take an active role in this. And we have that in Europe at the SME level. In addition to my roles at RISE and OpenForum Europe, I also was very pleased to join the board of Drupal Association last year. And it's very interesting for me to see that such an important technology, for example, European Commission's websites run on Drupal, this is a technology where we have a lot of expertise in Europe. 44% of contributions to the Drupal project come from Europe. We have many SMEs that deliver customized solutions to their clients based on this open source technology. But we need that to happen at a larger scale. We need that to happen at a larger scale. Alberto, I'll let you come in now before I start saying a lot of things that are the same, really.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, this concept of I think we need this kind of basic blog, and I it's also must, I understand from the Nexus Forum project, we will also be engaging in this process of defining for the first time in Europe what European open source means. But I think this concept of sovereign open source, I have to say, I wasn't involved in creating these questions, but so just to clarify. But the concept of sovereign open source project is very interesting, right? So what is a sovereign open source project? And then we get into something that's related with this concept of European open source, which is also the governance, whether the debate on whether or not we need in Europe, for starters, our own kind of governance model for producing open source, which might or might not lead to the need for a steward or a new foundation or something like that. But at least the first step will be to understand, do we need a governance model for open source that guarantees that these projects are controlled in the way that we want it to be controlled? It's governance, it's technical decisions, but also the kind of more strategic decisions are taken by European organizations, and can be then incorporated into a larger strategy to mobilize the technological resources and innovation we have in Europe for the sovereignty objectives. I mean, that would be my first question. So how we scale and support these projects? I think the first step will be for those projects and those companies and organizations that feel that they need a governance model that ensures that they keep control on their projects and their technologies and their decisions. We need to offer them a different governance model. It might not be the case that everyone in Europe needs this kind of governance model, but for some strategic projects, I think we need to offer something different. And we have that experience as well. I mean, already in Europe, we all know the Horizon Europe program, right? But we also know the European Defence Fund program, right? And if you're not a European organization and you are not under European control, you cannot participate in this program. So there are mechanisms to make sure that an open source project, for instance, can be protected in that sense. And then after that, we can start mobilizing resources and support from the European Union and the rest of the industry to help these projects grow.
Thank you, Alberto. Sachiko, before I give you word, I would like us to be mindful of time and maybe deeply through the next question, if that's okay. So for the next question, I would like you to indeed briefly go through the challenges in adopting sovereign solutions in industry and public sectors. So what are the real world hurdles, either technical, cultural, or regulatory? So Sachiko, would you like to start, and maybe you can also reiterate on what you wanted to say?
Yes, I am also mindful of time. I think, I'm a sort of, last week I was at the UN, and I moderated a panel on open source program offices that are being established at the government level. And I think that, challenges are many. Challenges can be also real challenges or perceived challenges. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting started, etc. I think what I'm seeing at the public sector and for governments, there's a lot of high-level endorsement of open source, that sort of governments are saying that we agree in principle and we see that the potential benefits and we should support this, etc. Taking practical first steps, for example, by establishing an open source program office at the government or corporate level is a really important step, I think, to understanding both how an organization can benefit from open source, use open source, contribute to open source, etc., but also to learn from others by networking with other open source program offices. So I'll just, because we don't have time, I'll just say that institutionalize it, like go from high level support and curiosity to make it somebody's day job to actually promote open source and to understand how the organization can leverage open source. So it just it's not just, one-time statement.
Thank you, Sachiko. Alberto, your words on this? Yeah, very quickly. I think that's also something we're trying to deal with or fix from the Nexus Forum and other initiatives is the surprisingly, I mean, despite all the, the internet, right? And all these different technologies, communication and stuff. I think people in some specific companies and public agencies, when they approach this challenge of going for a solution or an alternative from the sovereignty perspective, they still, I mean, they take that decision based on that criteria or mostly on that criteria. They still feel alone, I mean, isolated. I mean, they don't feel they are part of a larger movement. We're starting to see things change, but I think we have to make more efforts in connecting that people, because I think that also helped at the beginning with the early adopters in open source. I see the same thing that happened 20 years ago when people trying to migrate to Linux, let's say, they started to come together and say, okay, you're not crazy. I mean, this can be done. So I think we have to make an extra effort to do that, to bring together and create this community of people, early adopters, let's say, but this from the sovereignty perspective, from the different organizations that are actually being brave or crazy enough to challenge the dependencies that their organizations have on technology from big tech, for instance, and looking for an actual alternative. And we have to bring them together so they also feel that they are not crazy. I mean, it can be done, and it's more people also doing that. They're part of something bigger. I think that's a challenge we have to, and we are in the process of fixing. Thank you, Alberto. Now we will swiftly move through the Q&A questions, and the first one is: are there other options other than using open source software to achieve digital sovereignty? So, would you like to take that one?
sure, I mean, sovereignty, but then the question becomes like sovereignty from who or for what? I mean, I think that, you know, if I develop my own solutions, I'm not depending on anybody else, but I think that it's, you know, and then I just think that, well, I don't know if the question, Alberto, if you wanted to give it more consideration. I think that for me, open source is it's not for maybe for every case, but I think, you know, as an overall strategy, is our best chance to still like to still benefit from world-class technology and have digital sovereignty. So, you know, yeah.
You know that quote, right? That they say it's data is the new oil, right? I don't really like it that much, but it makes me always think about one of the first things a country does when they become independent from a colonial power is to nationalize their oil industry, right? So I guess we at some point, maybe, who knows, maybe in the future, governments will start thinking about, should we nationalize data centers? Should we seize the assets of big tech in Europe? I mean, we also always crying about the lack of GPUs and servers and hardware. And we have all of them in the data centers in our countries, but they are owned by American companies, right? So I wonder if at some point some politician will say, look, our ancestors used to do this. So a few decades ago, why don't we start nationalizing this infrastructure instead of having to buy them from non-EU providers? I mean, they are already there. Yeah, that's some crazy idea. But I mean, if someone wanted to regain the digital sovereignty, they at some point they could start thinking about that. We'll see.
Thank you, Alberto. And then we also have a question. I think this is related to what Sachiko was saying. So we have a question to, don't you think open source adds transparency and trust, reduces dependencies with GAFAM, controls data and standards, maximizes innovation, and supports EU values? So Sachiko, on those topics, your simple is...
Yes, I think that we had a very short session in the end to cover everything. And I think it's not just open source doesn't only contribute to, you know, narrowly to digital sovereignty. I think it can also, there are a lot of benefits to open source, also to innovation and to economic growth, etc. So, you know, yeah, I agreed to all points.
Thank you. And then also just to cover the rest, that people do agree with you that in some cases open source software could still cause vendor lock-in, but that could shape or that could or should be fixed over time with more market uptake and the creation of healthy competition, as well as to establish an EU-wide sovereign tech fund. We also have a comment that open source OSPOs are being created all over the places, and these could be very good channels to promote and improve on OSS governance within organizations. And the last is that while we talk about adoption of OSS platforms, should we have the next meeting on an open source platform? And with that, I would like to invite everyone to keep the discussion going and to join the working groups, especially the one on sovereignty in open source that we had today. So many things to cover, many controversial but also quite relevant topics to discuss. So we do invite you to go to this link or scan the QR code, so eucloud-iot.eu/working-groups, and to sign up, and you will be onboarded to the Nexus Forum community. Last but not least, we would also like to invite you to register for our Nexus Forum Summit, where we will be bringing all the working groups and all the relevant stakeholders. So please do join. The topic of the next summit will be AI, cloud, and sustainability for Europe's digital sovereignty in November in Brussels. Attendance is free of charge, but of course, registration is mandatory. So with this in mind, I would like to thank everyone for joining us, asking great questions, but most of all, to Sachiko and Alberto for providing us with great insights and for leading the working group. So thank you very much and have a lovely rest of this Monday.